We're getting down to the last part of our Christmas stocking. Everything's looking really good so far. So now it's time to do the toe. I'm just finishing up my last 2 stitches of my my candy cane stripe pattern that's in here. And do you remember, if you watched the last video, you'll remember that I said that I had followed the pattern and ended up with these little peek through of the yellow yarn in my red section here. So at the top of the pattern I did the same thing, in that the first round of my red I did 2 knits 2 purls. So I have a little bit of peek through of the red in there to give me a corresponding little blip of color in that yellow section. Obviously you could do exactly what you want with this Christmas stocking pattern because it's your stocking. So feel free to add your own design elements to this project. To work the toe, we're going to go back to working on our double pointed needles, and so I'm going to take off my beginning of the round marker and I've cut my yarn that I was using before, and I'm going back to the green yarn that you received a few days earlier, and my double pointed needles from December 11th. And we're just going to knit. The pattern says to work 18 stitches per double pointed needle. So again, I just loop the yarn over the double pointed needle and then find the tail that is attached to the ball, and I'm going to work 18 stitches on each DPN, removing markers as I come to them, especially if they're not in the right place. So let's get set up knitting in the round for this toe. Two, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. Pick up a new double pointed needle and knit another 18 stitches. So here I am getting to the end of my circular needle, knitting the last 18 stitches onto my 4th double pointed needle. Put the circular needle to the side and turn my stocking around here. So lots of yarn tails in here, but don't worry about that. We'll take care of them a little bit later. If the first and last stitch of your previous round feel a little bit loose, you can always just give a little tug on those tails to tighten everything up. I just want to explain to you here how to look at these double pointed needles. So we've got 4 DPNs in our work. The beginning of the round always works at the middle of the bottom of the foot. So that doesn't matter whether you're working on a sock or a Christmas stocking, your foot would be, the bottom of your foot would be down here. So the beginning of your round always begins there. And that's so that if you do change colors and you end up with a bit of a jog in your pattern, it's always at the bottom of your foot, or in the case of our Christmas stocking, it's on the fold where it's hanging, so you don't see that join. Therefore, the first needle that you would work on, we call needle number 1. The second needle is needle number 2, the third needle is number 3, and the fourth needle is number 4. So you will always begin your round on needle 1 and finish your round on needle 4. When we do the decreases for your stocking toe, you want those decreases to be curved around the top of your sock and the bottom of your sock. So the decreases will always happen in the corners. Now when you have this on 4 needles, there's the possibility of more than 2 corners. So that's where knowing what your needles are numbered, or thinking about how your sock's going to look when you're finished, is important. If you were to squish your sock flat like this so that the heel is flat, and this is the beginning of your round, then you would want your decreases to happen at this side and at this side. So as you work around, you'll see the instructions tell you that to start on needle number 1, you'll work until there are 3 stitches left on that needle, and then on those last 3 stitches you'll knit 2 together, then knit 1. Then when you go to work on needle number 2, you're going to knit 1, do an SSK decrease, then knit the rest of the needle, knit needle number 3 until you have 3 stitches left, knit 2 together, knit 1, and on needle number 4 you will knit 1, SSK decrease, and then knit to the end of the round. So let me just show you how those decreases work. Picking up your 5th knitting needle and making sure that you are working with the yarn that is attached to the ball, tucking all those other ends inside, you'll begin by knitting on needle number 1, which is your first needle as you start at the bottom of your heel. So I'm going to knit on this needle until there are 3 stitches remaining. Okay, and when I get to those last 3 stitches, you knit 2 together and then knit 1. Take your empty needle, put it in your right hand, turn your work a little bit, and now we're going to knit 1 and do an SSK decrease. To do an SSK decrease, you will slip 1 stitch and then the next stitch as if to knit. Insert the tip of your left hand needle into the front of those 2 slipped stitches and then knit them together on the back needle. I'll do that again in a minute. So now we knit to the end of this needle or to the top of your stocking. So this is the end of needle number 2. And you don't want any decreases along the top of your stocking, so nothing happens here except plain knitting. I'm now working on needle number 3. And on needle number 3 I work to the last 3 stitches and then knit 2 together, knit 1. Okay, knit 2 together, knit 1, and I'm at the beginning of needle number 4, working my way back to the beginning of my round, and I'm going to knit 1 and do an SSK. So slip 1 stitch as if to knit, slip the 2nd stitch as if to knit, insert the tip of your left hand needle into the front of those 2 slipped stitches and knit them together with your back needle through the back leg of those stitches. Work your way back to the beginning of your round. And the next round is plain knitting. So you get a rest round in between the decrease rounds. 1 round of decrease, 1 round of plain knitting. You will continue to work the decrease round alternated by the plain round until you have 48 stitches in total. So when you have 12 stitches here, 12 here, 12 here, and 12 here, then you're going to do the decrease round every round. So keep knitting a plain round and then a decrease round, plain round, decrease round until you have 12 stitches here, 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 and here, and then we'll work to the next section. When you are reduced down to 48 stitches in total, so 12 stitches per needle, you'll then begin to decrease every round. So knit 2 together at the end of needle number 1, SSK at the beginning of needle number 2, knit 2 together at the end of needle number 3, and SSK at the beginning of needle number 4, or 1 stitch in as the decreases are placed. And you'll do that every round until you are down to a total of 24 stitches, so 6 stitches per needle. If you find that you prefer to have less needles in play, you could put all of your stitches for the top of your sock on one needle and continue to use 2 double-pointed needles for the bottom of your toe. This is a technique that will allow you to just have less needles in play, and then if you feel like you have a weak spot in one place, you can always put all the stitches on one needle and avoid that. When working with double pointed needles, you always need to have at least 3 needles holding the stitches and 1 needle available to knit with. So you can work with 4 needles in total instead of 5, and sometimes that just makes things a little more efficient. Okay, keep decreasing every round. I believe this gives you a nice rounder shaped toe until you have 6 stitches per needle or 24 stitches in total. We'll talk about grafting and closing the toe next. I'm now finishing up the last of my decreases, so I'll end up with 6 stitches on this needle number 4. And at the end of this needle, you put down your empty needle and you continue to knit across needle number 1. And that's because in order to do either of the toe closing techniques, you need to have your stitches parallel on 2 needles. So I'm just going to continue to knit across needle number 1, and then I'm going to cut my yarn. Okay, so the reason why we have you decrease every other row and then every row is that I feel like this gives you a much rounder toe than it would be if you just carried on decreasing every other row. Plus, I sort of figure like about halfway through the toe, you're tired of knitting the toe, so let's just get it done. Now you're going to cut your yarn, and we're going to choose one of 2 grafting techniques. So I've cut off about, I'm going to say about 12 inches of yarn. It's more than I need, but enough to be comfortable. There's a couple of different ways that you can close your toe. One is to do a Kitchener stitch graft, which I'll show you right away here. And the other method that's quite common for toes is to do a 3 needle bind off. If you want to do a 3 needle bind off, you could bind off across the outside of your toe, but you leave a little seam on the outside of your toe. And if you're doing a regular sock, that's not so bad. But I think because the stitches are so big in here that it would be nice if that seam was tucked inside. So the way to do that then is to turn your sock inside out. Now, it's really difficult to turn your sock inside out through this really tiny hole here and to pull your sock through that hole. Trust me, it's with the double pointed needles, it's almost impossible. So what you need to do, if you want to do that, is put your toe stitches, take them off the double pointed needles and put them onto a bit of waste yarn, and then you can easily turn your sock inside out. So let's do that first, and then we'll come back and do the Kitchener stitch grafting. So as you can see here, I've put my stitches on a length of waste yarn. I've left a loop here, and I've left a little tie here. And so these are my 12 stitches on one side and my 12 stitches on the other. And now I can turn my sock inside out like this. And pull that waste yarn to this side here. The sock wants to curl over to the inside, but don't worry, you can make it bend to your will. So I'm going to take out my little slip knot there, and I'm going to take 2 of my double pointed needles, start with 1 at a time, and I'm going to slip the stitches back onto my double pointed needle. So I find where the yarn has gone in, put my needle on there, find the next one. It helps to use waste yarn that is slippery, so this one's totally synthetic. It's a little bit of cord. but cotton, any kind of plant fiber will work, linen, cotton, anything like that. And if you find that it's hard to find the stitch, that it's sunk up a little bit, you can pull a loop on the other side of your string and give the stitch a nice tug to make it larger, and then pull it through. Let me do that again. So take your string so that you have a little bit of string on either side of your loop, and pull the loop up so that you can see it nicely and put it on your needle. 2, 4, 6, I got 6 more to go on this side. There's 7. And it doesn't matter which side you start with because you're using double pointed needles. So no matter where you left your tail, it'll be at one end of your needle, which is a good thing. So I guess I should have said for this one that I did as well cut the tail, and I left a nice lengthy tail to do the 3 needle bind off with. Let's see here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Okay, now I'm going to come across here. That one's, for some reason, that one looks like it belongs on this side, so I'm just going to go back to the beginning here, take a second double pointed needle, and put the stitches back on this way. 2, 3, 11, and 12. Once you've got all your stitches on the 2 needles, double check to make sure that you have the same number of stitches on each needle. So on my forward needle here I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and on my back I have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. You need to have the same number of stitches on each needle in order to do a 3 needle bind off. Now find the tail of your yarn that's probably tucked on the inside. And again, don't worry if you're looking at your needles this way and your yarn is over to the left, that's no problem, you just turn it around. So you need your yarn to be on the right hand side of your work. Take a 3rd needle, so this is called a 3 needle bind off because you need to have 2 needles holding the stitches, the live stitches on your on the needles, and you need a 3rd needle to work with. So here's how this works. Pushing your needles close up to the tapered end of the needles, you take your 3rd needle and you insert it into the 1st stitch on each needle. And your first step is to knit those 2 stitches together so they can come off your needle. Then you insert your 3rd needle into the 1st stitch or the next stitch on each of those 2 double pointed needles, and you knit them together again. Take those stitches off the needle, and then use one of your parallel needles to pass the 1st stitch on your right hand needle over the 2nd stitch on your right hand needle. Do that fairly, don't do it too tight. Insert your right hand needle tip into the next stitch on your parallel needles, knit them together, take those stitches off the left hand needle, then use one of the left hand needle tips to pass the earlier stitch over the later stitch. So again, insert your right hand needle into the 2 stitches on your parallel needles, yarn over, pull the yarn over through to knit those 2 stitches together, take them off the left hand needles, and then pass the stitch that is furthest right over the stitch that is furthest left, or as I like to say, the earlier stitch over the later stitch. Give that just a little bit of movement in here. Don't make it really, really tight. Okay, so continue to knit 2 stitches together off your parallel needles, then pass the earlier stitch over the later stitch. So that's the actual bind off that's happening here. This is grafting those 2 stitches together and then binding them off. So knit 2 together, bind off. Knit 2 together, bind off. Here are my last 2. Bind this one off, and then your last maneuver is just to pull that loop out. I have a long tail here, so I'm just going to pull it through. So there's the 3 needle bind off on the inside. It's nice and secure, and then if I turn it back so that the right side is facing out, you'll see that I have a nice, neat edge to my stocking toe. And for a lot of people, that's just an easier method than Kitchener stitch. But we'll do Kitchener stitch next. If you'd like to graft your stitches, your toe stitches together using Kitchener stitch, you just need to make sure that you have the same number of stitches on each of your double pointed needles. So one needle is holding 12 of your stitches and the other needle is holding 12. So I'm just going to do a quick count here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And this is a sewn bind off method, so you don't have to, or sewn grafting method, so you don't need a third needle. What you do need is a wool needle. So in your advent box, you got a package of these really nice wool needles, yarn needles. And the reason I like them so much is because they have this little nylon, you see that? This little nylon loop at the top, which is very easy to thread. So I'm going to use that to graft my stitches together at the top of my stocking. So I left myself a nice long tail, probably longer than I need it to be. You need enough yarn to basically make a row of knitting in between your stitches, so I like to overestimate a bit. All right, I'm going to put my wool through this yarn. You'll see how easy that was to thread. Kitchener stitch is, there are lots of ways to describe it. I'm going to describe it to you in the way that I learned how to do it. And so that's using your wool needle to perform the grafting, but using the terms knitwise and purlwise. So in the Kitchener stitch, we have a 4-step sequence. And I'll get into that in a second, but to start with, we're going to do a setup on the first stitch on the front needle and the first stitch on the back needle. So to be set up properly, your yarn should be coming off to the right, and it's attached to the last or the first stitch on your back needle. So we have a front needle and a back needle, and you have a wool needle. Insert the wool needle into the first stitch on your front needle as if to purl. Draw the yarn through and leave that stitch on your needle. Now insert your wool needle into the first stitch on your back needle as if to knit. So when you knit, you go in towards the right. Draw that yarn through and make sure that the yarn doesn't loop over your needle. So we don't want to create another stitch here. Put your yarn in between your needles to draw it through, or underneath that front needle to draw it through. This is called the setup. Now here comes the 4-step sequence. You're going to insert your wool needle into the first stitch on your front needle as if to knit, so to the right. Draw the yarn through and take that stitch off your needle. Then you're going to insert your wool needle into the next stitch on your front needle as if to purl, draw the yarn through, and keep that one on your needle. Now we'll go to the back needle, insert your wool needle as if to purl into the first stitch, draw the yarn through, and take that stitch off your needle. Then insert your wool needle into the next stitch on your back needle as if to knit, draw the yarn through, and leave that stitch on. Okay, so there are 4 steps. The first one is to insert knitwise and take the stitch off, then to insert purlwise and leave the stitch on, then move to the back needle, insert your needle purlwise, take the stitch off, then insert your wool needle into the next stitch knitwise and leave the stitch on. So I'm going to do that again, but just abbreviate my motions a little bit. So knit, I'm on the front needle, knit off, purl on. Give it just a gentle tug. Back needle, purl off, knit on. And by on, I mean leave it on the needle. I'm going to do that again. Knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. Okay, so you're always working with the first 2 stitches on the front needle, and then you're working with the first 2 stitches on the back needle. Now the first stitch on each needle always comes off, so knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. And if you remember that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, then you can even leave the on and off parts out. So in my head, when I'm doing Kitchener stitch, I'm simply saying knit, knit, purl, purl, knit. You could say knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on, or just remember the off and on and go knit, purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, knit. Knit, purl, purl, knit. See how my finger is holding that stitch on there? Because when you're working close to the tips of your stitches, they have a tendency sometimes to fall off. Thank goodness for these bamboo double pointed needles, which are a little stickier. Knit, purl, purl, knit. Knit, purl, purl, knit. So get to the last couple of stitches here. Knit, oops, split a stitch there, knit, off, purl on, keep that one on the needle for now, purl off, knit on, and for the last 2 stitches we just do the off parts. So knit, Insert knitwise, pull that needle off, insert purlwise, take that needle out, remove that hair that got caught in there, and you're done. So this is the Kitchener stitch grafting. And what's magical about Kitchener stitch is that the rows, because you've replaced your stitches with a row of knitting in between, you basically just grafted the stitches, it's pretty much invisible and seamless. The hard part about Kitchener stitch grafting is that you may not get your tension exactly right. So if I put my fingers in there, I can feel that some of the stitches here are looser than other stitches. So I can adjust my tension by pulling on a loose stitch and working that loose stitch over to the edge where my tail is coming out. You can make this grafting technique too tight, or you can make it too loose. I think if you're going to err on the side of anything, too loose is better than too tight, because it's much easier to tighten your stitches, in my opinion, than it is to loosen them. When I get to the end there, I simply pull on that one and I've evened out my tension. Still maybe a little bit loose, but I can still even that out a bit if I want to. So again, to do that, you're just going to pull on the stitches to get rid of any excess tension and take it all the way across to the edge of your toe. By the way, if you have a snag in your knitting, this is exactly what you would do to even out the tension on that row. Okay, now I'm happy with it. This tail, so oftentimes when you're finished doing your Kitchener stitch, you get a little bit of a flap right here at the end, and that's easy to deal with as well. You're just going to take your wool needle and insert it right under that flap into the inside of your stocking, and sometimes I just poke my needle through, pull that yarn tail to the inside, and voila, it's gone. Okay. There's your grafted, seamless Kitchener stitch heel toe. So next we're going to address weaving in your ends and some of the other finishing techniques, including blocking.